Afternoon, guys. Hope you're all doing okay. We've got to a really exciting bit, so I'm going to get straight onto it. The chapter is called Journey to London. There's a great picture there to start us off of the BFG with Sophie in his ear. Apparently it's very comfortable. Okay. The great yellow wasteland lay dim and milky in the moonlight as the big friendly giant went galloping across it. Sophie, still wearing only her nightie, was reclining comfortably in a crevice of the BFG's right ear. She was actually in the outer rim of the ear, near the top, where the edge of the ear folds over, and this folding over bit made a sort of roof for her and gave her the most wonderful protection against the rushing wind. What's more, she was lying on skin that was soft and warm and almost velvety. Nobody, she told herself, had ever travelled in greater comfort. Sophie peered over the rim of the ear and watched the desolate landscape of giant country go whizzing by. They were certainly moving fast. The BFG went bouncing off the ground as though there were rockets in his toes, and each stride he took lifted him about 100 feet into the air. But he had not yet gone into that whizzing top gear of his, when the ground became blurred by speed, and the wind howled, and his feet didn't seem to be touching anything but air. That would come later. Sophie had not slept for a long time. She was very tired. She was also warm and comfortable. She dozed off. She didn't know how long she slept, but when she woke up again and looked out over the edge of the ear, the landscape had changed completely. They were in a green country now with mountains and forests. It was still dark, but the moon was shining as brightly as ever. Suddenly, and without slowing his pace, the BFG turned his head sharply to the left. For the first time during the entire journey, he spoke a few words. "Look, quick, over there," he said, pointing his long trumpet. Sophie looked in the direction he was pointing. Through the musky darkness, all she saw at first was a great cloud of dust about 300 yards away. "Those is the other giants, all galloping back home after their guzzle," the BFG said. Then Sophie saw them. In the light of the moon, she saw all 9 of those monstrous half-naked brutes thundering across the landscape together. They were galloping in a pack, their necks craned forward, their arms bent at the elbows, and worst of all, their stomachs bulging. The strides they took were incredible. Their speed was unbelievable. Their feet pounded and thundered on the ground and left a great sheet of dust behind them. But in 10 seconds, they were gone. "A lot of girlsies and boysies is no longer sleeping in their beds tonight," the BFG said. Sophie felt quite ill. But this grim encounter made her more than ever determined to go through with her mission. It must have been about an hour or so later that the BFG began to slow his pace. "We is in England now," he said suddenly. Dark though it was, Sophie could see that they were in a country of green fields with neat hedges in between the fields. There were hills with trees all over them, and occasionally there were roads with the lights of cars moving along. Each time they came to a road, the BFG was over it and away, and no motorist could possibly have seen anything except a quick black shadow flashing overhead. All at once, a curious orange glow appeared in the night sky ahead of them. "We is coming close to London," the BFG said. He slowed to a trot. He began looking about cautiously. Groups of houses were now appearing on all sides, but there were still no lights in their windows. It was too early for anyone to be getting up yet. "Someone's bound to see us," Sophie said. "Never as they seen me," the BFG said confidently. "You is forgetting that I is doing this sort of thing for years and years and years. No human being is ever catching even the smallest wink of me." "I did," Sophie whispered. "Ah," he said. "Yes, but you was the very first." During the next half hour, things moved so swiftly and so silently that Sophie, crouching in the giant's ear, was unable to understand exactly what was going on. They were in streets. There were houses everywhere. Sometimes there were shops. There were bright lamps in the streets. There were quite a few people about, and there were cars with lights on. But nobody ever noticed the BFG. It was impossible to understand quite how he did it. There was a kind of magic in his movements. He seemed to melt into the shadows. He would glide, that was the only word to describe his way of moving. He would glide noiselessly from one dark place to another, always moving, always gliding forward through the streets of London. his black cloak blending with the shadows of the night. It is quite possible that one or two late-night wanderers might have thought they saw a tall black shadow skimming swiftly down a murky side street, but even if they had, they would never have believed their own eyes. They would have dismissed it as an illusion and blamed themselves for seeing things that weren't there. Sophie and the BFG came at last to a large place full of trees. There was a road running through it and a lake. There were no people in this place, and the BFG stopped for the first time since they set out from his cave many hours before. "What's the matter?" Sophie whispered in her under-the-breath voice. "Oh, he's in a bit of a puddle," he said. "You're doing marvellously," Sophie whispered. "No, he isn't," he said. "I is now completely boggled. I is lost." "But why?" "Because we is in the middle of London and suddenly we is in green pastures." "Don't be silly," Sophie whispered. "This is the middle of London. It's called Hyde Park. I know exactly where we are." "You is joking." "I'm not, I swear I'm not. We're almost there." "You mean we is nearly at the Queen's Palace?" cried the PFG. "It's just across the road," Sophie whispered. "This is where I take over." "Which way?" the BFG asked. "Straight ahead." The BFG trotted forward through the deserted park. "Now stop." The BFG stopped. "You see that huge roundabout ahead of us just outside the park?" Sophie whispered. "I see it. That is Hyde Park Corner." Even now, when it was still an hour before dawn, there was still quite a lot of traffic moving around Hyde Park Corner. Then Sophie whispered, "In the middle of the roundabout there is an enormous stone arch with a statue of a horse and rider on top of it. Can you see that?" The BFG peered through the trees. "I is seeing it," he said. "Do you think if you took a very fast run at it, you could jump clear over Hyde Park Corner, over the arch and over the horse and the rider, and land on the pavement the other side?" "Easy," the BFG said. "You're sure? You're absolutely sure?" "I promise," the BFG said. "Whatever you do, you mustn't land in the middle of Hyde Park Corner." "Don't get so flussed," the BFG said. "To me that is a snitchy little jump. There is not a thing-a-ling-a-ling to it." "Then go," Sophie whispered. The BFG broke into a full gallop. He went scorching across the park, and just before he reached the railings that divided it from the street, he took off. It was a gigantic leap. He flew high over Hyde Park Corner and landed as softly as a cat on the pavement on the other side. "Well done," Sophie whispered. "Now quick, over that wall." Directly in front of them, bordering the pavement, there was a brick wall with fearsome-looking spikes all along the top of it. A swift crouch, a little leap, and the BFG was over it. There's a picture of him leaping over the wall. "We're there," Sophie whispered excitedly. "We're in the Queen's back garden." The next chapter is called The Palace. "By gumdrops," whispered the big friendly giant. "Is this really it?" "There's the palace," Sophie whispered back. Not more than 100 yards away, through the tall trees in the garden, across the mown lawns and the tidy flower beds, the massive shape of the palace itself loomed through the darkness. It was made of whitish stone. The sheer size of it staggered the BFG. "But this place is having 100 bedrooms at least," he said. "Easily, I should think," Sophie whispered. "Then I is boggled," the BFG said. "How is I possibly finding the one where the Queen is sleeping?" "Let's go a bit closer and have a look," Sophie whispered. The BFG glided forward among the trees. Suddenly he stopped dead. The great ear in which Sophie was sitting began to swivel around. "Hey," Sophie whispered, "you're going to tip me out." "Shh," the BFG whispered back. "Oh, he is hearing something." He stopped behind a clump of bushes. He waited. The ear was still swinging this way and that. Sophie had to hang on tight to the side of it to save herself from tumbling out. The BFG pointed through a gap in the bushes, and there, not more than 50 yards away, she saw a man padding softly across the lawn. He had a guard dog with him on a leash. The BFG stayed as still as a stone. So did Sophie. The man and the dog walked on and disappeared into the darkness. "You was telling me that you had no soldiers in the back garden," the BFG whispered. "He wasn't a soldier," Sophie whispered. "He was some sort of a watchman." We'll have to be careful. Well, he's not too worried, the BFG said. These waxy big ears of mine is picking up even the noise of a man breathing the other side of this garden. How much longer before it begins to get light? Sophie whispered. Very short, the BFG said. We must go pell-mell for leather now. He glided forward through the vast garden, and once again Sophie noticed how he seemed to melt into the shadows wherever he went. His feet made no sound at all, even when he was walking on gravel. Suddenly they were right up close against the black wall of the great palace. The BFG's head was level with the upper windows one flight up, and Sophie, sitting in his ear, had the same view. In all the windows on that floor the curtains seemed to be drawn. There was no light showing anywhere. In the distance they could hear the muted sound of traffic going around Hyde Park Corner. The BFG stopped and put his other ear, the one Sophie wasn't sitting in, close to the first window. No, he whispered. What are you listening for? Sophie whispered back. For breathing, the BFG whispered. I is able to tell if it is a man, human being, or a lady by the breathing voice. We has a man in there, snortling a little bit too. He glided on, flattening his tall, thin, black cloaked body against the side of the building. He came to the next window. He listened. No, he whispered. He moved on. This room is empty, he whispered. He listened in at several more windows, but at each one he shook his head and moved on. When he came to the window in the very centre of the palace, he listened but did not move on. Ho, ho, he whispered. We has a lady sleeping in there. Sophie felt a little quiver go running down her spine. But who? She whispered back. The BFG put a finger to his lips for silence. He reached up through the open window and parted the curtains ever so slightly. The orange glow from the night sky over London crept into the room and cast a glimmer of light onto its walls. It was a large room, a lovely room, a rich carpet, gilded chairs, a dressing table, a bed, and on the pillow of the bed lay the head of a sleeping woman. Sophie suddenly found herself looking at a face she had seen on stamps and coins and in the newspapers all her life. For a few seconds she was speechless. Is that her? The BFG whispered. Yes, Sophie whispered back. The BFG wasted no time. First, and very carefully, he started to raise the lower half of the large window. The BFG was an expert on windows. He'd opened thousands of them over the years to blow his dreams into children's bedrooms. Some windows got stuck. Some were wobbly. Some creaked. He was pleased to find that the Queen's window slid upward like silk. He pushed up the lower half as far as it would go, so as to leave a place on the sill for Sophie to sit. Next, he closed the crack in the curtains. Then, with finger and thumb, he lifted Sophie out of his ear and placed her on the window ledge with her legs dangling just inside the room, but behind the curtains. Now don't you go tip-toppling backwards, the BFG whispered. You must always be holding on tight with both hands to the inside of the windowsill. Sophie did as he said. It was summertime in London and the night was not cold, but don't forget that Sophie was only wearing her thin nightie. She would have given anything for a dressing gown, not just to keep her warm, but to hide the whiteness of her nightie from watchful eyes in the garden below. The BFG was taking the glass jar from the pocket of his cloak. He unscrewed the lid. Now, very cautiously, he poured the precious dream into the wide end of his trumpet. He steered the trumpet through the curtains, far into the room, aiming it at the place where he knew the bed to be. He took a deep breath. He puffed out his cheeks and he blew. Now he was withdrawing the trumpet, sliding it out very, very carefully, like a thermometer. Is you all right sitting there? He whispered. Yes, Sophie murmured. She was quite terrified, but determined not to show it. She looked down over her shoulder. The ground seemed miles away. It was a nasty drop. How long will it take the dream to work? Sophie whispered. Some takes an hour, the BFG whispered back. Some is quicker. Some is slower still, but it's sure to find her in the end. Sophie said nothing. He's going off to wait in the garden, the BFG whispered. When you is wanting me, just call out my name and I will be coming very quick. Will you hear me? Sophie whispered. You was forgetting these, the BFG whispered, smiling and pointing to his great ears. Goodbye, Sophie whispered. Suddenly, unexpectedly, the BFG leaned forward and kissed her gently on the cheek. Sophie felt like crying. When she turned to look at him, he was already gone. He had simply melted away into the dark garden. The Queen. Dawn came at last, and the rim of a lemon-coloured sun rose up behind the rooftop somewhere behind Victoria Station. A while later, Sophie felt a little of its warmth on her back and was grateful. In the distance, she heard a church clock striking. She counted the strikes. There were 7. She found it almost impossible to believe that she, Sophie, a little orphan of no real importance in the world, was at this moment actually sitting high above the ground on the windowsill of the Queen of England's bedroom, with the Queen herself asleep in there behind the curtain, not more than 5 yards away. The very idea of it was absurd. No one had ever done such a thing before. It was a terrifying thing to be doing. What would happen if the dream didn't work? No one, least of all the Queen, would believe a word of her story. It seemed possible that no one had ever woken up to find a small child sitting behind the curtains on his or her windowsill. The Queen was bound to get a shock. Who wouldn't? With all the patience of a small girl who has something important to wait for, Sophie sat motionless on the windowsill. How much longer, she wondered. What time do queens wake up? Faint stirrings and distant sounds came to her from deep inside the belly of the palace. Then, all at once, beyond the curtains, she heard the voice of the sleeper in the bedroom. It was a slightly blurred sleep talker's voice. "Oh no," it cried out. "No, don't! Someone stop them! Don't let them do it! I can't bear it! Oh, please stop them! It's horrible! Oh, it's ghastly! No, no, no!" She's having the dream, Sophie told herself. It must be really horrid. I feel so sorry for her, but it has to be done. After that, there were a few moans. Then there was a long silence. Sophie waited. She looked over her shoulder. She was terrified that she would see the man with the dog down in the garden staring up at her, but the garden was deserted. A pale summer mist hung over it like smoke. It was an enormous garden, very beautiful, with a large funny-shaped lake at the far end. There was an island in the lake, and there were ducks swimming on the water. Inside the room, beyond the curtains, Sophie suddenly heard what was obviously a knock on the door. She heard the doorknob being turned. She heard someone entering the room. "Good morning, Your Majesty," a woman was saying. It was the voice of an oldish person. There was a pause and then a slight rattle of china and silver. "Will you have your tray on the bed, ma'am, or on the table?" "Oh, Mary, something awful has just happened." This was a voice Sophie had heard many times on radio and television, especially on Christmas Day. It was a very well-known voice. "Whatever is it, ma'am?" "I've just had the most frightful dream. It was a nightmare. It was awful." "Oh, I am sorry, ma'am. But don't be distressed. You're awake now and it will go away. It was only a dream, ma'am." "Do you know what I dreamed, Mary? I dreamed that girls and boys were being snatched out of their beds at boarding school and were being eaten by the most ghastly giants. The giants were putting their arms in through the dormitory windows and plucking the children out with their fingers. One lot from a girls' school and another from a boys' school. It was all so vivid, Mary. It was so real." There was a silence. Sophie waited. She was quivering with excitement. But why the silence? Why didn't the other one, the maid, why didn't she say something? "What on earth's the matter, Mary?" the famous voice was saying. There was another silence. "Mary, you've gone as white as a sheet. Are you feeling ill?" There was suddenly a crash and a clatter of crockery, which could only have meant that the tray the maid was carrying had fallen out of her hands. "Mary," the famous voice was saying rather sharply, "I think you'd better sit down at once. You look as though you're going to faint. You really mustn't take it so hard just because I've had an awful dream." That isn't the reason, ma'am." The maid's voice was quivering terribly. "Then for heaven's sake, what is the reason?" "I'm very sorry about the tray, ma'am." "Oh, don't worry about the tray. But what on earth was it that made you drop it? Why did you go as white as a ghost all of a sudden?" "You haven't seen the papers yet, have you, ma'am?" "No, what do they say?" Sophie heard the rustling of a newspaper, as it was being handed over. "It's like the very dream you had in the night, ma'am." "Rubbish, Mary, where is it?" "On the front page, ma'am. It's the big headlines." "Great Scott!" cried the famous voice. 18 girls vanished mysteriously from their boy beds at Rodian School. 14 boys disappeared from Eton. Bones are found underneath dormitory windows. Then there was a pause, punctuated by gasps from the famous voice, as the newspaper article was clearly being read and digested. "Oh, how ghastly!" the famous voice cried out. "It's absolutely frightful. Bones under the windows. What can have happened? Oh, those poor children." "But, ma'am, don't you see, ma'am?" "See what, Mary?" "Those children were taken away almost exactly as you dreamed it, ma'am." "Not by giants, Mary." "No, ma'am, but the bit about the girls and boys disappearing from their dormitories. You dreamed it so clearly, and then it actually happened. That's why I came over all queer, ma'am. I'm coming over a bit queer myself, Mary." "It gives me the shakes, ma'am, when something like this happens. It really does." "I don't blame you, Mary." "I shall get you some more breakfast, ma'am, and have this mess cleared up." "No, don't go, Mary. Stay here a moment." Sophie wished she could see into the room, but she didn't dare touch the curtains. The famous voice began speaking again. "I really did dream about those children, Mary. It was clear as crystal." It's getting very exciting. But will the Queen actually believe that it's real? We'll find out tomorrow. See you then, guys.